appreciates the significant impacts that exotic annual grasses and other invaders are having on our landscapes. But still, in my talk today, I'd like to review some of the impacts because I think they're useful to think about when we're devising treatments. And the impacts of exotic annuals and other invaders themselves can feed back on the effectiveness of control measures. And secondly, I'm going to describe some of the different types of tools that we have at small and large landscape scales. In a recent synthesis of exotic annual grasses across the entire Western US, we were able to reveal some very interesting patterns. Exotic annuals have been with the spread of Europeans throughout the United States, particularly Western US, starting back in the 1800s in California, in the Central Valley areas. Invaders such as different species in the genus Bromus, ripgut brome, cheatgrass, Bromus sectorum, which has now become very common in many areas of the Western US. They have invaded California and are now fairly well entrenched in that area. Moving further to the east, in the Great Basin, the invasion of exotic annuals in the Great Basin, as well as the Mojave and the Columbia Plateau, is also fairly well progressed. And now in the Front Range, in areas around Fort Collins, we're seeing that annual grasses have invaded some areas but are continuing to spread. And moving eastward into the Dakotas and elsewhere, the invasion, all the way out to the 112th longitude, the invasion is still continuing out there. And these exotic annual grasses and their impacts have been recognized for many years now, many decades. There's been a lot of investment into research and management on them, although perhaps not as significant an investment as is made in more economically valuable ecosystems such as forests. Nonetheless, in spite of all the management and research on these invaders, their impacts continue and continue to grow. These invaders are notable for the extent of their impacts in terms of acreage. So just for an example, I'm most familiar with sagebrush steppe. That's the ecosystem that I work mostly in. Back in time, there were apparently about 1 million square kilometers of the Western US dominated by sagebrush steppe. In the last few decades, we've lost about half of that habitat type to the invasion of exotic annual grasses. And so the scale, 500,000 square kilometers, is vast. And when you dive into the toolkit for dealing with invasive plants, there's not a lot available thus far to really help us eradicate and tightly control invaders of these sorts. So I'm going to focus mostly on semi-arid ecosystems, oftentimes rangelands. To the person who's first introduced to these ecosystem types, they seem fairly similar. They're somewhat dry. They tend to be oftentimes dominated by grasses or low-statured vegetation, and they seem fairly similar and homogeneous. But to the experienced manager or researcher of these settings, the variability is widely recognized. And so we're worried about transferability of information. We're dealing with large areas where techniques for controlling the invaders and the science underlying those techniques is usually developed for a few particular areas. The hotspots happen to be around, for example, Logan, Utah, or Reno, Nevada, or sites around Fort Collins, Colorado, or Boise, Idaho. Burns, Oregon is also a place where much research has been done. How well can the information from those sites be transferred to the other vast areas where we need to control and deal with these exotics? The interesting thing about exotic annual grasses in the western U.S. is that they, as a stressor, have united many different types of agencies and landowners. Everybody views them as a problem. And they've created concepts such as all hands, all lands. They force us to look across boundaries and enabling those sorts of all hands, all lands approaches is still underway. That's one of the exciting things that we can look forward to for future management. And it's also important to realize that, you know, when we deal with exotic species, oftentimes the first management action is eradication. We're going after the symptom of a land condition. It's also very important, and I'm going to emphasize in my talk today, to think about the stressors or the drivers of change, which could be climate shifts. They could be disturbances such as fire, development patterns such as with energy and human colonization, and other invasive species can also destabilize the plant communities. And oftentimes, and I'll emphasize this, we focus on one type of exotic, the one that's our immediate threat. It's very important to think about what other species could be coming down the pipe. I'll emphasize that. So the species that we're most interested in today, the triple threat, are Bromus tictorum, cheatgrass. All of these are exotic annuals, Medusahead, and Ventenata. And these are very interesting species because they follow several gradients. One is what we're observing is a replacement gradient, where oftentimes we'll see areas that have been invaded by Bromus tictorum being invaded by or replaced by Medusahead, which is a less desirable, and even though it might not be on the state noxious species lists, this species is far more noxious because it has, for example, a lot more silica, it's less palatable, and equally causes damage through fire and other impacts as cheatgrass. And Ventenata dubia, wiregrass, is a relatively new invader of many of our ecosystems, but we're seeing a fairly rapid increase in it. And it is considered to have even more silica than the Medusahead or cheatgrass, and is even less desirable. In addition to these three species, I want to point out that there are many other invaders in the Bromus genus alone. And some of those species, such as red brome, might be expected to move in to cheatgrass's terrain or territory with future climate changes. Also, there are many species of exotic taprooted forbs from Europe and Eurasia, such as spotted knapweed, leafy spurge, skeleton weed, which are increasingly becoming players and stressors on these ecosystems. And oftentimes those species can be secondary invaders of sites that have already seen these exotic annual species. So Matt Brooks is the expert on how exotic annual grasses affect fire patterns. So I only want to show you one slide here. He's going to talk more about this. But just so everybody appreciates, probably the biggest impact of these exotic invaders is to alter fire. The invaders fill in interspaces. They cure readily in the summer, and they provide a long season of high combustibility, increasing the chances of fire. And when the fire occurs, the exotic annuals more readily establish than the perennials. They can oftentimes outcompete the perennial reestablishment young seedlings. And they fundamentally alter the ecosystem type in ways that are very difficult to restore. And that's why we're here today. This is one type of disturbance. Mining, human development, other disturbances can poise these exotic annuals to increase. Probably if we were to generalize and think about the most significant general impact of the invaders, it's that they cause instability in our ecosystems, and that makes the The ecosystem is difficult to manage, difficult to glean ecosystem services from, and greatly detracts from wildlife habitat. So just by virtue of being annuals, their abundance is more variable from year to year and more tightly coupled to the vagaries of weather variation from year to year. And that, of course, has a ripple effect through the higher trophic levels. Because these exotic annuals tend to form low diversity stands, they're also subject to natural pathogens, most often fungal species like smuts, or black fingers of death, for example, on cheatgrass. And those pathogens can cause stand failure because these exotic annuals can occupy such vast landscapes. You can have massive instability, such as this, tens of thousands of acres here in Nevada that now have bare soil for a temporary period, and bare soil leads to erosion. That could be a restoration opportunity, but it's also a problem. So how well do we know the impacts of these invaders, and why should we be concerned? We should be concerned because the impacts feed back on our treatments to control the exotic annuals. So just to summarize, the exotic annuals, we think, and there's some evidence to show that they can do things to impact soil properties, such as infiltration. They can also affect the water underneath them. They tend to be shallow rooted, and they do not utilize the deeper soil moisture. That, by the way, is a good example of how exotic annuals cause a site to effectively be desertified, less productivity for a given amount of precious precipitation. Exotic annuals tend to goose or accelerate nutrient cycles. It's caused the nutrient cycles to become flashier, with pulses of nitrate availability. In addition to the lower productivity, there's higher variability in productivity, which impacts species that normally, at the low trophic levels, that would normally graze on herbs. And that, of course, ripples up into the higher trophic levels, such as birds of prey. Ecosystem services, such as forage for livestock, are affected. Some livestock managers are able to have their cows survive off of cheatgrass in part, but we tend to hear that they cannot glean much forage from Medusahead or especially Ventenata, probably because of the silica contents. How do we know these relationships? Well, oftentimes we see sites that are invaded versus uninvaded, and we compare the conditions. But often those conditions could be equally confounded by a third category of things, such as land use. Sites that are invaded might have had inappropriate grazing in some settings. The grazing could directly affect the exotic annuals as well as the ecosystem conditions. And so this is a confounding factor for our inferences on impacts. But more importantly, it's really critical to consider all three of these themes because they interact with one another. The exotic annuals, their success is strongly affected by what vegetation is present on site. And both the exotic annuals and these ecosystem conditions affect whether or not people are willing and able to graze a site, and whether or not fire occurs and the soil properties. So I just point this out so that you keep in mind the complexity of the situation in our future talks for today and on your field trip. Impacts of the exotic annuals depend on the ecosystem type. So there are differences in vulnerability to the exotic annuals, both in terms of the ability of the invaders to gain a foothold in the site, and then once present, how much do they actually alter ecosystem function? This differs around the Western US in different habitat types, and it can be crudely estimated by just considering what is being replaced by the exotic annuals. Obviously, if you replace forest with exotic annuals, you've got a fairly dramatic change. If you take a fairly continuous rhizomatous sod-forming grassland and you replace it with a sod-like mat of annuals, well, you might consider that that's a major impact, but maybe less of one. When we're considering, I think today we're going to be talking a lot about herbicides, which is a form of active management. Couple quick point on active versus passive management. Whether or not you choose to do something active like spray herbicides or seed versus passive treatments such as relieving the site from stresses which might be contributing to invaders, it's useful to think about how invaded the site is. Are you dealing with preventing an incipient invasion, or do you have an invaded site that you're wishing to restore? Obviously, passive treatments may help nip a imminent invasion in the bud, whereas restoring an invasive site obviously is going to require intensive active treatments. So active treatments can fall into three categories. We can do things to prevent the spread of the invaders, and that could be things like being careful with weed-free straw, which I believe is very difficult. Unfortunately for exotic annuals, they're not on the noxious list for many species. And so, for example, hay or gravel oftentimes can contain the seed, even though what's being purchased for hay or seed might be labeled weed-free. Once present, we can try to eradicate the exotics. Usually that's with herbicide. There's some attention being paid onto possible biocontrols for exotic annual grasses. These are very much undeveloped. Weed suppressive bacteria is one example, and it remains to be seen whether or not these will become viable tools. The disturbances themselves, which sometimes cause invasion, can be used in some settings to help reduce the exotic annuals or control their impacts, such as prescribed fire or sometimes grazing to remove the fine fuels that exotic annuals create that cause fire. And seeding is a very increasingly common way to increase the desirable vegetation, which can outcompete invaders. So seeding is really critical because it helps us think about the importance of native or desirable vegetation to provide resistance to invasion and resilience to further disturbance. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So this concept has become very pervasive in the Great Basin and sagebrush steppe, as well as many other habitats. The idea is that if you want to have a site which does not require repeated herbicide treatments, you've got to have a site that has some immunity to the invaders, and that can only come through the native or desirable vegetation. When I say desirable, sometimes non-native species are needed for particularly harsh sites or harsh problems. The idea with, for example, bunch grasses in the Great Basin, here's a species or a group of species which oftentimes have the shallow roots which match the shallow rooting of exotic annuals. Yet they also have deep roots that enable the bunch grasses to survive drought and things like that. We're actually monitoring root depth as a way to understand resistance and resilience. In addition to bulk soil properties, the soil surface, Dave Pike and colleagues have been exploring how biological crusts like mosses affect where cheatgrass might normally try to invade and germinate in the interspaces between perennial grasses. Biological crusts are very susceptible to disturbances themselves. So when we think about control options, what kind of criteria do we need to consider? First, the tools you have to be able to predict how they will function on the ground. And herbicides, by the way, are something that are fairly well tested. There's usually good research that goes in behind them on the herbicides before they're applied. And they give a fairly predictable short-term reduction of the exotics. Affordable. Since we're dealing with vast landscapes that are invaded, the agents cannot cost $500 per acre to apply or nobody will use them. They need to be something more like $10 an acre. And they have to be acceptable. In the case of herbicides, we're considering chemicals across the landscape. That can be challenging to get public buy-in. And then they've got to be practical. You've got to be able to apply them using tools such as aircraft to deploy over large acreages. And then the last point here, we're dealing with semi-arid systems which have both not much precipitation, but more importantly, highly variable precipitation from year to year. Herbicides, as well as other treatments, are weather dependent, and that poses a challenge for their application. A key tool is prioritizing treatments across the landscape. Since we're dealing with such large areas, we can't expect to do things like apply herbicide over all of the affected area. It's just too expensive. It's not feasible. So where do you apply? Where would you choose to invest? The resistance and resilience concepts developed by Gene Chambers, Dave Pike, Mike Pellant, Jeremy Mastras, and many other people, including myself, help us take a step forward in thinking about where should we put our chips. And the concept is, in general, you want to focus on areas that, number one, need intervention. Oftentimes our highest elevation, cooler and wetter regions, such as montane settings, the ecosystems have such innate resilience to disturbance and species that can recover vigorously and compete against exotic annuals and therefore provide resistance. They don't need the treatments. They're self-sufficient. Conversely, on the other end of the gradient, in our warmest, driest settings, like Wyoming big sagebrush with less than 12 inches per year of precipitation, they sometimes have such poor resistance and resilience. Once invaded, the cost of recovering those sites is steep and would require many years of iterative, repeated interventions that oftentimes we might be better off to think about which sites both need the investment, but also are recoverable. If you treat them, then you're likely to see a desirable response. And so oftentimes that's sites that are not overly disturbed and have a moderate climate associated with them in vigorous species. This is a crude oversimplification of these concepts. I'm sure we'll have more questions about them. The nice thing about the resistance and resilience concepts is that it is based on soil temperature moisture regimes, which are mappable. And this is suitable for management. For example, the red here is mesocaritic types of soil moisture regimes that are considered low to moderately resistant and resilient. So factors contributing to treatment success. Number one, pre-treatment plant community. What you have before you apply a treatment has a strong effect on what's likely to come after. Soils. Do you have a lot of clay? Obviously a major factor versus sands. Those soil textures will bind herbicides very differently, and they also affect water availability and therefore the effective climate for the invaders or species you're trying to restore. The stressors, such as inappropriate livestock grazing, are they controllable? Other causes of invasion, if they're continue to be present after your treatments, then obviously your treatment is less likely to be successful. I already mentioned secondary invaders. Is there a lot of propagular pressure from them? Too often we see that we target one species, like cheatgrass, only to be invaded by another. Let's say, oftentimes like clasping pepperweed or storksbill, erodium, other types of invaders can come in and effectively ruin a treatment. Related to pre-treatment vegetation, do you have residual species, typically perennials, ready to resprout and increase to fill the void left behind the eradication of your exotics? How well does your treatment tool match the timing of vegetation changes? Herbicides, typically like imazapic, are short-lived in their effects. Bunch grasses and other perennials may take years, sometimes 10 years to recover. That's really critical to think about. Whether or not you're applying your treatments during a drought or excessive rain can strongly affect things like herbicides. And probably the biggest factor I've come to realize is in many cases, managers are given a one-time investment and 1 year to apply a treatment. And oftentimes, especially in our warmer, drier sites, that's inadequate to generate success. Increasingly, we're seeing that given an opportunity to do adaptive management, managers are able to do iterative repeat interventions and achieve the goals of reducing exotic annuals and restoring desirable native plant communities. Let's see, I'm going to skip ahead here, fell a little bit behind. I want to finish with one point here, and that is how well can we know the pre-fire vegetation? If we're dealing with small sites, 100,000, 10,000 acres, oftentimes you know the vegetation that was present before a disturbance or before a treatment. But increasingly, we're seeing the treatments happen over very large landscapes. This is an outline of the 2015 Soda wildfire, about 300,000 acres. Managers devised many treatments that went on to the site, including almost 100,000 acres in herbicide applications and as much seeding of perennial species. One of the biggest challenges for determining which treatments to use where was uncertainty in what vegetation was on the ground before the fire. Increasingly, we're seeing an important tool for treatments is remotely sensed maps of, or estimations of where different species were in these landscapes, available through platforms such as MODIS or Landsat. In this case, you're looking at estimates of exotic annual cover derived from MODIS. This would have been the pre-treatment condition. This is 2 years after the fire. This is flown every 2 years. Fire happened in fall of 2015. And this right here shows the difference in pre to post fire. And some of these areas right here where you're seeing, like this dark shows a large increase in exotic annual cover. This actually happens to be a large area that was treated by herbicide. So there's lots of opportunity to improve these tools. Increasingly, we're seeing managers emphasize the need for these things. In the case of this particular landscape, this Soda wildfire, we happen to have be doing assessments of treatments in the context of adaptive management. We had over 2,000 points to validate the this exotic annual grass map. And interestingly, we found not very good agreement at the scale at which managers are applying the treatments. So anyways, I'm at the end of my talk here. And I just want to leave you with one final take-home message, and that is that we've really got to be thinking about the whole ecosystem and how the landscape functions. We may be dealing with the triple threat of these 3 species now, but I think we can all be assured that other invaders are going to come into our sites. And if we only focus on eradicating those 3 species, we're quite likely to be dealing with other potentially more serious exotic plant problems. Thank you. Let's see, I will click stop sharing.
Thanks, Matt. Everybody, we're just going to hold our questions until our first Q&A session at 10:05. So feel free to write those down and keep them in your brain. And if you are joining us online, you can put those questions and answers in the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen, and just we'll store them there and then administer them at 10:05. So next up we have Matt Brooks, and Gloria, go for it. Or I don't know if you have anything to say, but
yeah, hi. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, hi. Thanks very much, Matt. That was a really good overview. I really like especially the part of the effects on soils and distribution, and I have a ton of questions. Maybe I can post later. Just one other note that I wanted to share with everybody, as a federally funded, Southern Rockies is not an agency, but as a federally funded entity, I have to blab a real quick disclaimer that we're not putting this on to advocate for anyone, endorse a company or a product or or sales or call to action. This is for public gain and public interest and sharing wildfire information. And I can't remember if I said that in the introduction or not. So we'd like to welcome Matthew Brooks of the U.S. Geological Survey. How exotic annual grasses alter wildfire regimes across varying ecosystems in the West. So Matt, looking forward to what you have to say.
Okay, looks like it's launching here. Oh, there we go. Can we see my screen now?
Yes, sir. Looks good.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. Really happy to talk to you about some of the things I think I know. So the outline is this. Basically, I want to talk first about what I'm calling the invasive plant fire regime cycle, just general relationships between invasive plants and fire that evolve into feedback cycles. And then talks about specific relationships between broma species and fire that sort of relate to the invasive plant fire regime cycle concept. So to start off with, I think it's really important to understand what a fire regime is. Oftentimes we think of fire as a binary thing. Something's either burned or unburned. But really what affects things ecologically is the patterns of fire across time, space, and magnitude. And so when you look at these various characteristics of what constitutes a fire regime, it's important to understand that all of these things can potentially have very significant ecological and economic implications, both for natural resources and for cultural resources, as well as communities and that sort of thing, human communities. So, you know, for lack of a better term, the uninvaded, natural, native vegetation, whatever you want to call it, fire regime is affected by three things, this triangle of fuels, climate, which is weather over time, and topography. All four of these things combine to affect those fire regime variables in a particular point in the landscape that I just described. In an uninvaded native plant condition, all the fuels are created by native species, obviously. When you have non-natives introduced to the system, some combination of non-natives and natives constitutes your fuel conditions, which then feed into the fire regime along with climate and topography. Notice the one thing that in this system here that's fixed is topography, which of course changes over geologic time, and climate, which is increasingly shifting, but it's something which in terms of plant invasions is a separate factor, but it is an important factor. I won't get into how climate affects all this too much, other than to say that it is something which needs to be considered when evaluating any effects of fire over time, for sure. So when you get a situation where the fire regime, the fuel characteristics are promoting fire regime characteristics that benefit the non-natives versus the natives, you get a shift of the vegetation fuel bed, you can imagine, from native to non-native conditions, potentially changing the characteristics of the fuels. And that's sort of conceptually what we're talking about in terms of this non-native plant fire regime cycle, a feedback of non-natives affecting fuel conditions, affecting fire regime characteristics in a way that benefits the non-natives versus the natives. And over time, you can get a shift of landscapes to more non-native species dominance. Now, the one which I think probably most of the people on this webinar are most familiar with, and frankly, the one that most research has been done on, are non-native annual grass invasions, in particular cheatgrass, Bromus tictorum, into Intermountain West shrublands, in particular Artemisia sagebrush shrublands. Basically, you get a situation where they fill in the little mini fuel breaks in between the shrubs. You get ignition sources. Sometimes you get extreme weather events where you get multiple ignitions, and things like low humidity, high weather, high winds. landscapes oftentimes look like this after a single fire, but then after multiple fires, you get a conversion from this one that was originally dominated by natives and then co-dominated by native non-natives with the initial invasion to one that's almost entirely non-native. So that's where the starting point in this discussion is going to be with this particular example. With this the same example, I'm going to deconstruct this a bit to kind of talk about some of the specific changes that are really happening here in fuels and fire regimes. So the specific fuel changes are that over time with repeated burning in short intervals, you get a situation where you get lower fuel loads or lower coarse fuel loads. So the woody species are becoming less prevalent. The fine fuel load, which are the annual grasses, herbaceous stuff, increases. The continuity increases across the landscape, so it's the continuous fuel beds, and the ignitability increases because the fine fuel loads are like kindling essentially compared to the coarser fuel loads. And so the fire regime changes that occur is that you get a longer fire season, you end up with larger fires, you end up with greater fire frequency in particular. Now notice here that I don't have listed here magnitude in terms of fire intensity, which is the energy release due to fire, and which sometimes is sort of mistakenly referred to as fire severity, which is actually the ecological effects of fire. I don't have intensity here because in many respects the caloric content of the fuel bed is lower with the fine fuels of the annual grasses compared to the woody fuels. And in some respects, the actual intensity of the fire might be reduced in this establishment of a grass fire cycle. But definitely the size of fires, frequency of fires, and seasonal fire season is increasing. Now I want to switch a little bit and talk a little bit more about this part about why does increased fire or changes in the fire regime in one way or another, fires per se, how do the fires themselves, an individual fire, promote the dominance of non-native invasive plants? So one way that fires increase dominance of non-native invasives is by removing overstory, increasing light availability. It's not as much an issue in more open, arid, semi-arid shrublands, but it is in some other systems, as I'll show you a little bit later on. Perennials may not be established quickly, and as I mentioned at the last bullet down there, it's more prevalent, more of an issue in high cover areas. This is a really good example. This is a post-fire shot 6 years after a high severity fire. Now that term high severity means it had a high ecological effect on the forest. You could see what's left in the forest with the snags in the background. This was basically a closed canopy forest that had very little light reaching the ground. 6 years post-fire, this fire burned through as a crown fire. It completely consumed much of the woody fuels in the forest, extremely high severity, as well as high intensity. But the result was lots of light. And this is a picture of cheatgrass 6 years post-fire in this particular forest. So fires can also increase nutrient levels, availability. I think Matt mentioned some of this a bit. You can increase the actual cycling of nutrients that increase their availability, especially available forms of nitrogen. This is significantly important where soil nutrients are already naturally low. And this is an example of arid, semi-arid shrublands. An example from the Mojave is this lower left corner down here. This was a creosote bush community in the central Mojave Desert in California, north of Barstow. And this was 10 years post-fire. These skeletons are creosote bushes that were killed. The interesting thing is that actually even the intensity of this fire wasn't particularly high because you can see the skeletons are still there. But in this particular location, creosote bush didn't resprout, didn't survive. I should mention that creosote bush is highly variable in its resilience to fire. I could do a whole other talk about that. And the red sheen, this is red brome, Bromus rubens, which is the biggest concern in the Mojave Desert in terms of grass fire cycle issues. Should also be mentioned that fire management activities can promote invasions through dispersal, bringing in materials on machinery, on equipment that personal equipment, PPE, but it can also increase resource availability. This is an example of a fire break where sort of higher elevation interior chaparral, juniper sort of community, a little bit artemisia in there, some Persia. And so it should be noted that there's a trade-off here with fire management activities, not just Matt mentioned like herbicides, but also things like retardant, phosphate-based retardant have been shown to actually fertilize landscapes and promote dominance of grasses in local scales. But the benefits of, in particular situation, of stopping a fire by creating a fuel break or using a retardant drop might actually outweigh the potential drawbacks. And so this is something which needs to be considered specifically for different ecosystems separately, and sort of tailor that information for that local area. These next two slides I think are pretty interesting. They talk about, or they show some of the data associated with some work that Kyle Merriam and John Keeley did on fuel breaks in California. This particular one is showing that non-native cover increasing following fire. This is not the fuel break part, this is the fire part. So a single fire, this is distance from fuel break with multiple fires. So right at the fuel break, in the fuel break, you have increases in fire up to 3 fires, and you can see that with multiple fires, it maintained a higher level of relative non-native cover all the way out to 40 years in this chronosequence. So recurrent fire obviously is something that's increasing the dominance of the non-natives, and even in areas both on and away from the fuel breaks. This is actually time since fire on and away from the fuel breaks. And this is interesting because this is just a fuel break itself without fire. On the fuel break, you can see that up to 30 years, there was an increase in the relative cover, but even going out to 40, well, it starts to converge about 40 meters away from the fuel break. But in adjacent areas, there's actually probably an increase in propagules on the fuel break that then disperse outward away from the fuel break. So this is another consideration for fuel breaks anyways, in terms of non-natives, that they might, well, they definitely do provide opportunities for non-natives to move into landscapes, but the benefit of the fuel breaks may outweigh the detriment of promoting plant invasions into landscapes if fire is a significant management concern related to non-native invasives in particular. So this is data, this is information, it needs to be applied to local ecosystems and evaluated contextually. So this slide summarizes, it's what I kind of think are the important considerations in evaluating whether you have a grass fire cycle or invasive plant fire regime cycle established. And that is, you need to document that the plant invasions change fuel beds and fire behavior characteristics. Demonstrate fuel bed changes have altered the spatial temporal magnitude distribution of fire in the landscape. So they've altered the fire regime. And thirdly, show that the new fire regime promotes the dominance of the fuels that drive it. What's interesting is that this has not specifically been applied all that rigorously to evaluate the potential for grass fire cycles or any non-native plant fire regime cycle worldwide. Yet the effects of plants on fire regimes is non-native plants, plant invasions, is often cited as a real threat of plant invasions. And so I think in the science, this really needs to be applied more vigorously. I mean, even within, let's just say the Intermountain West, and determining, saltbush, Wyoming sage, mountain brush, Mojave, creosote, whatever, thinking specifically, you have bromus species in all of these places, but determining where those areas are most of a threat to an altered fire regime takes more thought than just the presence of the bromus. In the coming slides, I'll talk about how to maybe evaluate that a little bit more specifically. So as I segue into this part, Matt already introduced the concepts of resistance to bromus invasion, resistance to annual grass invasion in general, and resilience of native vegetation to fire. I'm going to get into a little bit more specifics relative to bromus species. This basically comes from this chapter in this recent bromus book. Some of that stuff that Matt was one of the editors on this. I think that this provides a helpful context to understand a little bit when and where and why a bromus fire cycle might be a threat. The non-native grasses that can alter fire regimes, I'm going to focus on bromus, but obviously we have Medusahead, Ventenata, we got schisma species, which most people aren't familiar with, but it's a real issue in the Mojave in particular, as a non-native annual grass, and in some respects something that does promote altered fire regimes in some limited areas. These are the bromus species in the western U.S. That were considered in this chapter. Most of, as I mentioned before, the big poster child is cheatgrass, as we all know, or red brome in the warmer deserts. But madrotensis is a big one, especially in Mediterranean systems, as is diandrus is a big one in Mediterranean systems, and in the Western Great Plains, field brome, Japanese brome is a big issue. So very quickly, resistance refers to the ability of a landscape to resist bromus invasions. It often is related to soil. It's often related to temperature and soil moisture, as Matt mentioned, in terms of those NRCS soil moisture and temperature regimes. Generally speaking, warmer, drier conditions have lower resistance. Cooler, wetter areas have higher resistance to bromus. This is an example of some data that shows that some of these species cluster around the warmer end of the spectrum in terms of their occurrences relative to annual minimum and maximum temperatures. In terms of precipitation, some cluster a little bit less broadly in terms of precipitation on the drier to the wetter end of the spectrum. The really interesting thing, I think, is all these outliers out here for diandrus, tectorum, and hortiaceous, which suggests that these are occurrences from a very large database. And there's a bunch of outliers that occur at the really, really wet end of the spectrum of these species. To me, these are probably occurrences in openings in forest and whatnot that allow the species to be present but not dominant. And to me also, these three species are potentially really poised to become more dominant in those systems if the overstory in the forest, for example, becomes less prevalent, possibly through altered fire regimes. Resilience is the ability of the native vegetation to recover following fire. And generally speaking, you got a difference between warmer, drier, and cooler, wetter conditions. I'll provide some examples of this in a minute about how it's relevant. So one example from the Mojave, really low resilience of blackbrush, ability of blackbrush to recover from fire, facilitates Grassfire Cycle. So basically, you get an uninvaded blackbrush, you get, in this case, this is both cheatgrass and red brome in the interspaces between the blackbrush. You get a single fire, pretty much stand replacing. You might have Joshua trees recovering, but the blackbrush is something that by some measures takes centuries to recover. And then this is actually an area, so this is on the Beaver Dam slope of within tortoise habitat of Southwest Utah. This is a little further west, just about, you can see this if you look west off the Beaver Dam slope. And this is in the Tule Desert region of Lincoln County, Nevada. So this is a fairly easily type converted area associated with the non-native grasses, red brome and cheatgrass, and fire. And this condition can last a long time. This is 7 years post-fire back in 1946 in that same Tule Desert area. This is the same location, another 63 years post-fire. So another, whatever that is, 56, 55 more years, 56 years more years. And this was taken in 2002. So you can see that after a single fire, not even after recurrent fire, you still get a landscape, and this is red brome. This, by the way, is red brome in the foreground that you can see in the small texture grain. Now, mixed conifers have really high resilience. If you get a an appropriate understory, low severity, low intensity surface fire that mostly consumes the surface and doesn't consume the trees. Needle cast, which is what you see here, only 2 years post fire, can suppress cheatgrass and can, you know, it's pretty resistant to Grassfire Cycle unless you get an altered fire regime, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So the major ecoregions of the Western U.S., in this example from this chapter, we broke them into 5 ecoregions. These ecoregions vary as this is what Matt referred to, Germino, in his previous presentation about the soil temperature moisture regimes. These were mapped by NRCS. We utilized these data layers for the different regimes. We ended up with these are each of the regimes that range, generally speaking, from hot, dry, and lower resistance resilience to cool, wet, and higher resistance resilience. And we evaluate each of these fire regimes separate, or each of these ecoregions separately in terms of the broma species and the resistance to broma species, bromas that were present, major broma species present, as well as the resilience to disturbance fire in particular. I'm just going to go through real quickly some of these, those 5 regions. These are the primary species among regions. Mediterranean is the most diverse here with these multiple species here. Cold deserts, Tectorum and Rubens primarily in terms of the broma species. So first, the warm desert. Up top is resistance across a range of vegetation types that go from hotter, drier to cooler, wetter. Both among ecoregions, you get this gradient of hot to dry to cool, wet, but also within the regions, you get the gradient. And so generally speaking, this is lower elevation, middle, higher, and highest elevation, and the perennial grasses are where we start to get into some summer rainfall. And it's a kind of a special case in terms of elevation, but generally going from lower to higher elevation. Resistance-wise, Bromus rubens, there's high resistance really low here because it's super hot and dry. And this is where schismus actually occurs. As in the middle elevations of creosote to blackbrush is where the lowest resistance of Bromus rubens is. This is where you get most of the dominance of Bromus rubens in this range. And when you get to the higher elevations or more productive systems of the perennial grasslands, Bromus rubens there's more resistance because of competition from the perennial species. Bromus tectorum tends to do the best down in these higher elevations as well as in the perennial grasslands because the conditions are more mesic there. In general, Bromus rubens adapted for drier conditions than Tectorum. Now, in terms of resilience, it's very low. Recovery from fire is very low until you get up into these more productive systems. Now, if you take this all together, what does it mean for the potential of the Bromus fire cycle? It means that where you have low resistance and low resilience, that's where your potential is highest. So in the Mojave, we see it in the creosote bush to blackbrush range. That's basically what that information can be used as. So in the Mojave, this is where most of the concern is and should be for Grassfire Cycle. Interestingly, a lot of times the fires occur up here, at the higher elevations, higher productivity. Oftentimes there's a lot of, well, I should say in the past, there's been a lot of intensive post-fire management to try to reduce dominance of potentially Grassfire Cycle. That's actually in an area where resilience is higher and the native species often recover more readily. And so it's a little bit somewhat dubious about whether we should be concerned ourselves there. This is the real challenge. This, by the way, too, especially creosote, this is tortoise habitat. There'll be some discussion about that in the next presentation. Mediterranean California, in California. Lots of species going on, lots of things going on. Generally speaking, there's also land use changes that can have reduced resilience in particular. Various reasons up here in the Box conifer, increased fire severity due to increased accumulation of fuels over years of fire suppression. Down here overgrazing. Take-home message, though, is where you have low resilience and low resistance of, in particular, Bromus rubens and Bromus diandrus, these two species here. That's where we see most of the Grassfire Cycle establishing in the sage scrub situation in Mediterranean California. Cold deserts, which probably most of the people here are more familiar with. salt desert up to mountain brush. This is generally speaking an elevation gradient. Probably familiar that the lower to middle elevations are the ones that where most of the bromus is occurring. It's also where the lower resilience is, and it's also where the potential for the grassfire cycle is greatest. Western Great Plains, where I don't think people, we have thought too much about in terms of the grassfire cycle. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say that, you know, generally speaking, resistance is high and gets lower here for species like cheatgrass and Japanese brome. Things like droughts, though, the droughts are considered by the folks that understand that system most as being the thing that's really changing resilience of the native vegetation in different ways, in different systems. But, you know, there's the potentially here, if you get extreme droughts that really affect resilience, maybe in this region here, you might get a grassfire cycle, or down here where you have a, you know, maybe if something happens here in terms of overgrazing. But this is a situation where the potential for grassfire cycle is probably the least of all the Western ecosystems. And it deserves much more, I think, exploration and research. And then finally, Western forests. The potential for the grassfire cycle is highest rate in this area of the mixed conifer, but only where altered fire regimes have, in particular, decreased fire frequencies over time have resulted in fuel buildup that results in type conversions and following a single fire, like I showed you the picture earlier by Keeley in the star fire. So basically, if you're not removing the overstory, it's fairly resilient. But if you remove that overstory and create these openings, it creates a situation because for Tectorum is relatively already kind of in a lower resistance range. And so that's an area where the bromus fire cycle is probably the highest. So in summary, I think some important take-home messages regarding especially the second half of what I was talking about. The resistance resilience models for each species we presented are something which I think can be useful to help evaluate the relative threats posed by bromus species associated with altered fire regimes. The support for the cold desert or warm desert models is fairly well established, but there's really a need to test the predictions of all these in all 5 ecoregions. I think that a good way to look at those models is to consider them as hypotheses that could use further validation and further testing. But they're based on solid theory, and I think help inform management now as they are. But in terms of research in the future, I think that would be useful to look at them more in more depth and specifically test their predictions. And the last one I think is really important. Just because a particular bromus species is a problem in one area doesn't mean it's that same bromus species is a problem in other areas, or other bromus species moving that area pose similar threats. So just because cheatgrass is a big problem in the Great Basin doesn't necessarily mean it's a major problem now anyways, currently in, say, the Western Great Plains, or possibly in the, you know, forested Western forests. And so it's important to look at these things contextually for sure in evaluating their relative threats. And as Matt mentioned, you know, when you control one species, sometimes you get these unintended consequences of other species becoming more dominant. And that's always a consideration with species control. So prioritization initially to determine how important it is to control them, and then understanding what might come following them. Thank you.
Great, Matt. Thanks a lot for sharing those thoughts. I'm going to introduce Roy and ask all of our other speakers to, if you're not speaking, just turn your camera off so that if the folks in the symposium in the library, if they want to see the face of the speaker, that's the only person's face who will be displayed. So up to you guys. Next, we're going to hear from Roy. Go ahead and start sharing your screen, Roy, and I'll introduce you. He's going to talk about iconic at-risk species in the Mojave Desert endangered by the spread of invasive annual grasses. And after that, we'll hear from Lindy, and then we will have a 10-minute Q&A session. So folks that are tuning in through the computer, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A window, and we will get to those during the Q&A session. So if you're not speaking, turn your camera off. If you forget, I will turn you off, and then we will do Q&A after Lindy. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation to speak. And as Megan indicated, I'm going to be talking about the Mojave Desert and some of the species affected by invasive annual grasses there. First off, I wonder if I get rid of this. Nope. Sorry. First off, I want to acknowledge USGS for a lot of the work that they've done. A lot of my presentations based on work from USGS, in particular, Leslie DeFalco, Todd Eskew, and Christina Drake. I borrowed several of their slides. I'm going to summarize some of the work that they're doing in the Mojave on desert tortoises directly, or tortoise habitat as it relates to annual grasses. Also, as you heard from Matt Brooks, Matt has also done a lot of work in the Mojave. I can't come close to explaining the details of the Grassfire Cycle and a lot of that, as well as Matt. Luckily, Matt did all that, so I can just show a few slides and blast through that and get to some of the other issues in the or related issues in the Mojave. So. So to set the context, our typical Mojave Desert setting is this arid shrubland typically dominated by creosote bushes and burr sage with, as you can see, sparsely vegetated intershrub spaces. Some parts of the desert also include yucca woodlands, including Joshua trees as seen here. These intershrub spaces can fill in, though, with annual forbs following good rainfall, good winter rainfall years in particular. This is an example of Mojave Desert shrubland after a good winter rainfall year, with blue lupins and yellow sundrops interspersed in between the dominant creosote bushes and white burr sage. Increasingly, though, as you've seen, dense carpets of invasive non-native grasses, especially in the Mojave, as Matt pointed out, red brome, Bromus rubens, are filling in the intershrub spaces and forming dense clusters under the shrubs, and then subsequently leaving behind thickets of standing dead material. One spark can ignite that standing fuel, causing fires that sweep through large landscapes where historically they would have just burned themselves out in a small area. That leads often to these denuded landscapes with just charred remains of the larger plants immediately after such fires. But as Matt also showed, this can then fill back in with even denser, more uniform stands of non-native grass, like this expanse of red brome in the Great Basin of northwestern Arizona. So onto the focus of my presentation, as indicated by the title. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the species at risk from annual grasses in the Mojave and some of the work going on to deal with this threat. As I already mentioned, one of the iconic species of the Mojave Desert is the Joshua tree, which is currently being considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Increasing temperatures and more frequent drought are already affecting Joshua trees, and its distribution is projected to shrink under climate change. So annual grass-caused wildfires just further compound the predicament that this species is in. Lane Mountain milkvetch is another plant species in this case in the western Mojave Desert. It was listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in 1998. And as you might gather from all the pin flags in this photo of a survey, Lane Mountain milkvetch grows intertwined among branches of other shrubs for support, so any grass-fed fires in its habitat would be devastating to this species. Horned lizards comprise a group of unique species, including the flat-tailed horned lizard, which is a species of special concern in southernmost California and southwestern Arizona. The flat body plan of horned lizards allows them to camouflage themselves in open, bare ground, but it also makes it difficult for them to navigate areas with thick grass. This slide shows not a particularly dense stand of Schismus barbatus or Mediterranean grass that Matt mentioned, but you can imagine the challenge that this, in this case, desert horned lizard would have working through dense brome, finding its prey of harvester ants, and achieving the same level of camouflage from predators as on open ground. That said, USGS research in coastal sage scrub in Southern California found an increase in harvester ant abundance in burden plots, which was associated with an increase in coast horned lizards. Coastal sage scrub, however, contains much denser chaparral than the more open Mojave Desert, so it's uncertain whether the desert ants and horned lizards would respond similarly in this particular ecosystem. Now, of course, the Mojave Desert tortoise is probably the most iconic species in the Mojave Desert, and invasive annual grasses like the red brome shown here are a significant threat to the species. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the desert tortoise, the various impacts that brome and other annuals like Mediterranean grass have on them, and some of the work going on to improve tortoise habitat. The Mojave Desert tortoise ranges throughout both the Mojave and Sonoran deserts on the north and west sides of the Colorado River. And the species was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1990. Desert tortoises spend a lot of time in burrows, which they usually construct below shrubs like this creosote bush. And not only is the desert tortoise the charismatic mesofauna of the Mojave Desert, it's considered an umbrella species in the Mojave, largely because of the shelter their burrows provide for dozens of other species of wildlife, such as leopard lizards and rattlesnakes, ground squirrels and jackrabbits, beetles and spiders, and even several birds, most notably being the burrowing owl. Shrubs are also important as temporary shaded rest stops during the hot summer days. This tortoise would have little chance of survival if a fire swept through the brome to the dead and dry branches of this shrub. But tortoises in burrows are not necessarily safe either, because fire can still kill them underground via asphyxiation or heat. Recall this photo of the spring annual forbs in the inner shrub spaces. This scene represents, even in less dramatic or spectacular years, the forage that desert tortoises rely upon. Normal tortoise diets consist of a broad diversity of native forbs, with a few native grasses, perennials, and cacti mixed in. The native annual forbs and grasses that are important to tortoise diet reside in the shallow soil layer, that is the seed bank. Wildfire in the middle elevation blackbrush areas and low elevation creosote bush scrub has little effect on the seeds of non-native species such as red brome or storksbill erodium, mostly due to their incredibly high numbers. So this chart shows unburned habitat in black brush and creosote bush in gray, and burned in red. And so you can see that if anything, the seed bank has increased and burned following fires for these non-natives. Oops. Yeah. However, the native grasses and forbs are the seeds of those species are dramatically reduced. Here in this study by Leslie DeFalco, the native grasses declined in these two communities by 73% on average, and native forbs by over half as well. That said, native plants can germinate in burned habitat, and this is an example of post-fire response of some short-lived perennial plants on an extensively burned area following good rain. So preventing habitat from reburning is critically important. Tortoises use habitat that, like I just showed, that is recovering from wildfire by venturing into burned areas where the short-lived perennials such as desert globe mallow recolonize. Globe mallow, besides providing cover, is a great forage plant for tortoises. And you can see down here in red the increase in live canopy cover through 2010 in this patch of desert that burned in 2006. However, when adults of these short-lived perennials die, less canopy cover is available for tortoises to use. The lines on this graph show how tortoises moved further and further into the burn. So this is tracking tortoises with radio telemetry in the vicinity of the burn. And as the perennial cover increased, tortoises ventured further and further into the burn. But 5 years after the fire, they began retreating as the large perennial plants started dying and were unavailable to provide suitable cover. Desert tortoises do eat these grasses. There's a lot out there. Tortoises are fairly generalist feeders and will sample just about anything. And if there's a lot of invasive grasses, they'll end up eating those. And an example of that is a study that recorded over 200,000 bite counts for 98 tortoises in California, Arizona, and Utah. And from those tortoises, 41% of the diet consisted of brome grasses, schismus, and as well as red fillery and Russian thistle. That doesn't mean that annual grasses are good for them, though. In this experiment, tortoises fed diets or fed grass diets performed much more poorly in terms of both growth and survival than tortoises on forb diets. The brown dots in these graphs highlight the all brome diets, and while the green dots highlight the all forb diets, and then different combinations or mixtures of those are in between. So in the top panel here, you can see the differences in growth and juvenile tortoises over a 4-month period, and there's a stark difference in much lower growth of tortoises on brome diets compared to all of the other diets, especially the native forbs. At the time, those tortoises on native forbs had 100% survival during the period, while those the longer tortoises were on an all brome diet, the less well they survived, or had to be removed from the study just to prevent them from ultimately dying. Basically, compared to native annual forbs, the grasses and this includes not just brome, but schismas, even the native grasses, as you can see with the lower triangles for Vulpia, a native grass in the Mojave. The grasses just lack the nutrients that are essential to supply the nutritional and energetic requirements of young tortoises. So we expect tortoises in the wild to have disproportionate amounts of brome, especially perhaps as well in some of the areas that Matt mentioned, to do similarly poorly. Brome seeds can also cause physical injury to tortoises, becoming impacted in the oral mucosa, the tongue, and the choana. Up to 93% of tortoises in this study had impacted seeds in their mouths, and 28% of all these tortoises overall showed subsequent inflammation resulting from that impaction. Finally, malnutrition can also affect immune and physiological functions that as a result of an over-reliance or of grasses in their diets. Genes indicative of physiological, immune, and metabolic functions were transcribed at lower levels of individuals fed grass diets, especially bromus, indicating a potential greater susceptibility to disease or other health-related problems. And disease was one of the factors. It's a current concern for desert tortoises. It was one of the factors that precipitated the listing of the tortoise under the Endangered Species Act. And so this relationship of forage quality, habitat quality, and disease is a major issue. Specifically, genes important for calcium metabolism, shell formation, and growth, as well as overall nutritional condition and immune functions, were downregulated in yearling tortoises eating only grass diets. So to summarize, invasive grasses, especially brome, can cause physical injury to desert tortoises. Reliance on these grasses for forage can lead to malnutrition, slow growth, and poor health. Then, if they ignite, tortoises are directly killed in sweeping wildfires, which then can result in total habitat conversion and the elimination of tortoises from the landscape if we can't get a handle on invasive grass proliferation and this increasing fire cycle. So given the nasty effects of invasive grasses on the Mojave Desert, USGS developed a fire risk model to predict fire occurrence in the northeastern Mojave Desert to help prioritize areas for restoration. Here they first developed a spatial model using remote sensing data to predict fuel loads based on field estimates of fuels. They then modeled fire risk using satellite imagery, their fuel load model, and spatial data on ignition potential related to lightning strikes and distance to roads, as well as topography and climate variables such as maximum and minimum temperatures. So this map shows in Clark County, Nevada, here's Las Vegas, kind of in the middle, the areas most susceptible to fire based on their model in orange. A couple of areas to note here that are particularly relevant to tortoise management are this large expanse, which broadly overlaps an area designated as critical habitat for the tortoise, and another broad area over here, which was which is the site of a recent population augmentation effort. And so in these cases, there's some direct management needs or applications for as far as tortoise recovery, potentially focusing on for restoration or improving habitat for tortoises. And toward that end, numerous partners are working on restoration projects across the Mojave Desert. And much of these efforts are supported by the Bureau of Land Management's Mojave Desert Native Plant Program, which responds to the goals of the National Seed Strategy for Rehabilitation and Restoration. And most of the bureaus of the Department of Interior are involved in some level of restoration across the desert, as well as the Departments of Defense and Energy. We've got state and county conservation and management departments, and a slew of private and non-profit profit entities partnering and on different projects across the Mojave. So I'll talk a little bit about some of these projects, and mostly done by USGS. And in this case, the pre-emergent herbicide imazapic was used to reduce or to suppress non-native annuals and release from competition the native species that are important to tortoise diets in both single burn and repeated burned areas. And you can see that in both cases, the reduced level of exotic grasses post herbicide treatment, but also how that reduction crept back up and results in the need for herbicide reapplication to maintain the suppression. This is a trial comparing multiple herbicides in combination with seeding with native perennial species, and the imazapic containing herbicides outperformed the other combinations as well as the controls several years after the after implementation. This is the density of the seeded species several years after application. So it is possible to suppress invasive grasses and open up a window of opportunity to establish native perennials, which are important to the habitat structure for the desert tortoise. So where's restoration of the Mojave Desert headed next? We've seen that herbicide can be successful at smaller scales and shows promise at larger scales. Seeding can work for short-lived species, but we're finding that the seeding and getting long-life shrub dominance is still challenging. Tortoises do respond to recovering vegetation, and so restoration is expected to enhance the habitat quality. Now we want to look more holistically at prioritizing areas for restoration while continuing to determine the suitability of native plant materials and to evaluate restoration practices. And then taking the next step to actually assess tortoise compatibility with or response to our restoration efforts. And in particular, we've been coordinating with USGS on the intersection of all these ideas to evaluate revegetation success more than a decade after fires and treatments were implemented in southern Nevada, and how juvenile tortoises will fare when put into these actively restored habitats. So even though we've had good success with short-lived perennial recovery, we're exploring conventional and novel ways to reestablish shrub dominance, such as the creosote bush, burr sage, and Joshua trees, so tortoises can use restored habitat in the long term. Habitat islands are being implemented in these burned areas in southern Nevada, and I think we're in year 2 of a 3-year project of implementing islands using imazapic to suppress the invasive grasses and produce fuel breaks within larger burned area landscapes. Sowing seed and outplanting are being implemented as conventional ways of reestablishing the long-life perennials, but the project is also applying diversionary seeding or using decoy seeds in greater abundance to divert consumption of the desired native shrubs by rodents like this kangaroo rat. the eventual target outcome of this will be habitat islands that are self-sustaining, which will expand over time as the adult plants reproduce and spread seeds outside of the island areas. But the question remains, do our habitat restoration efforts result in improved fitness of desert tortoises? So we will be releasing juvenile tortoises as probes to evaluate the habitat with different densities of native plants and different proportions of invasive grass. And that will hopefully help us address the question of whether, even if red brome in this case cannot completely be eliminated, can habitat improvements be made via restoration that still benefit tortoises in the long run? So I'm going to wrap up with an example of a new weed management challenge or opportunity, depending on your perspective, I guess. You're probably familiar with the recent renewable energy boom in the Mojave Desert. Thousands of acres of occupied tortoise habitat have been cleared for especially solar energy developments like this one in the Ivanpah Valley. And typically when that happens, the habitat is bladed especially for photovoltaic, and you end up what was once nice occupied tortoise habitat, potentially with very little invasive grass encroachment, essentially being taken off the map for desert tortoises. However, what it seems that we're finally getting to a point with photovoltaic developments and a couple of examples that have recently been implemented or on the horizon, that rather than grading and totally removing the vegetation and suppressing vegetation and all basically wildlife in the area, instead elevating the panels and either actively or passively allowing the habitat to revegetate and allowing wildlife, including desert tortoises, to reoccupy or be returned to the solar installations. There's some reason to think that this could be beneficial because shade is a limiting resource in the Mojave, and there's certainly going to be a lot more shade. But there's also, as Matt Termino pointed out, with disturbance leading to greater potential invasive grass invasions, the possibility that these kinds of things with the disturbance from the development lead to a big grass field, which then is not good for tortoise health and nutrition, and is going to create a fire risk for the development itself. And so this will come along with some new opportunities for invasive grass management in a context that perhaps we haven't really had the chance to think about before. So with that, I think that's I'll wrap up, and we'll be around for the panel and questions.
Great, Roy. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. And next up, we have Lindy Gardner. She will speak about wildlife species impacted by invasive annual grass-fueled fires in the West. She's going to talk about sage grouse and beyond. So again, we will be doing our Q&A session after Lindy's talk. So stick around for that, and we can see your screen. And if you just presentation mode, we'll be good to go. Thanks, Lindy.
Oops. There, can you hear me and do you see my screen?
Yes, and yes, looks good.
Great, let me shut down one other thing over here. Great, Good morning, and thank you, everyone. Just to let folks know, especially compared to like Roy's talk, that was a great specific example at the end and sets up some additional discussion that I will talk about from an overall standpoint with wildlife impacts. But I don't conduct research on wildlife or wildlife impacts. Derek Sebastian just asked me to potentially talk about this. I thought this was a great opportunity to do a quick review or cursory review, if you will, of the literature and try to pull some of this information together because I did not have it for my files yet and it would be useful for our work in the sagebrush ecosystem. What I normally do is I support the Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System and our partners in the West for their invasive species management for operations, technical support, and a lot of regional and national policy issues as well. So today I'm going to cover, this is the outline and the caveats that I want to talk about. And so we're going to talk about why do we care about the impacts to wildlife species. We're going to talk about some caveats relative to what I'm discussing. From the outline standpoint, then we'll talk a little bit about context and scale when we think about impacts. I'll give a smattering of examples that I pulled from the literature. And then I really want to leave you with some things to ponder, if you will, about the importance of the perception of impact, which you just heard from Roy relative to like the solar technology that's going on out there. What's your perspective of that? Is it a negative or a positive? And the values that we place on these impacts. And then what can we potentially do? A few caveats are, I did only look, this was a cursory review or summary of information to pull some examples in the sagebrush ecosystem, so it is limited to the sagebrush ecosystem. And just wanted to remind everyone, of course, that I know, and I know you guys know, that any of these impacts that we're talking about may be confounded with other factors from the standpoint of association with other habitat variables, like distance to water and some of those things. This is just to get you thinking about the different types of impacts. And one thing I did not include are the impacts to wildlife from even just our management actions on invasive grasses themselves. So things like herbicide effects on potentially non-targets or our pollinators, or things that we're doing for management in the name of restoration or to reduce fire risk, where we're planting things like crested wheatgrass or forage kochia. Matt even mentioned a little bit with the field break work. I'm not really bringing in any of those impacts or not. So that's kind of the outline or the general gist of what I'll be talking about. I'd like to turn off one other thing here. It's not going to do it. Okay. So why do we care? Invasive species, as we all know, that's why we're all here, are pervasive and an intensifying form of disturbance. It alters wildlife habitat, threatens biodiversity, and they are a significant conservation threat. There's direct and indirect effects on wildlife by replacing that heterogeneous native plant community with a highly simplified composition and structured community. You've seen that in some of the previous slides very nicely. So we know they must have a profound influence on local wildlife communities, and then to what degree is that scale then expanded across the landscape? So we need to understand how species respond to this habitat alteration by invasive plants, and which species or guilds are most vulnerable to these changes is critical, because then we can start to do things like potentially prioritize place-based conservation to help prevent future listings, or maybe inform discussions of trade-offs among species conservation. It'll help us better understand the potential scope from additional disturbance across the landscape and identify potential impacts to that subsequent reach of the wildlife impacts, such as our own recreation opportunities. How's this going to impact the mule deer population in my particular area, or their migration corridor, energy development, just like we saw with the solar, or livelihoods of our neighbors. We have to think about the impacts and how we put this all into the perspective in terms of how we decide our management and where we place management. Another component of context is you see a lot of in the literature talking about change and impact, and I just kind of threw this up here for people to think about because it does start to get very intermingled. When we talk about the fire cycle itself, the fire cycle compared to the grass itself may have an impact. The change is to the fire cycle, or the change is to the vegetation structure. The change is fire frequency and intensity. And so then the impact are things like habitat loss and degradation, or loss of biodiversity. A change to an invasion might be food availability or forage communities. And so then we might see a decline in distribution and abundance on the landscape. And this starts to play in on these studies when you're trying to go through the literature and find things for your areas and that kind of thing. Just keeping that in mind. More importantly, down here at the bottom, I do want to mention, yes, we're only talking about wildlife impacts right here and right now, but we all recognize that there are extremely significant and important negative impacts that we need to think about relative to our neighbors' livelihoods and these communities, and they do come into play in our discussions that we need to think about. And we'll come back to this a little bit at the end. Okay. So kind of a little more on the context. As we talk about impacts, we have to think about several things. Intuitively, we understand invasion can potentially and substantially alter community structure. We've seen photos of that already. Or cause significant declines in population density. But often this is based on our assumptions, right? We just don't have a lot of evidence in some, especially on studies like the desert tortoise. That was great information. And so oftentimes all we have are assumptions. We also need to think about whether or when can there be an invasion and have no impact. And just because a non-native is present, is there always an effect? If no effect, then do we have to do something about it? And this comes into play, especially at the local level when we're looking at, again, priorities for management. We know invasions vary for where and how quick they respond based on space and time, the current level of invasion. And if it looks like there's no effect now, what about the time lag in the onset of that ecological impact or that wildlife impact? When do we take notice? When do we try to affect it? When do we try to create change there relative to that wildlife impact? These are all important things we need to think about as we talk about impacts, and I'll keep trying to tie it back to management. When looking at the studies, and some of these studies themselves mention these components, the degree to which the invasives alter the form and function of the native vegetation community really drives the level of the effect on the wildlife. That makes sense, right? The level of the effect on the wildlife depends on whether or not it's affecting a trophic level or a non-trophic, like a habitat pathway. And then, of course, whether it's a direct or an indirect effect. And some of my examples will show this, and we'll talk about mechanisms. And then, of course, the degree of the invasion, then that scope of that impact. Many studies are how invasion affects the composition and structure of the native plant communities and some ecosystem processes, but generally are not directly how they affect the native fauna or the wildlife. It's usually that indirect piece that they're looking at or able to measure. It's just there's limitations there for these types of studies. Very few are in enough detail to quantify even a population level effect on wildlife reliably, or to try to identify those underlying mechanisms that are causing those effects. And so on some of these examples that I pulled, we'll just talk about a few of them that, of course, the papers then talk about. We know that impacts can occur at various scales. Roy really set this up nicely with even that genetic piece. It can happen at the individual level, maybe only at the local scale, but then as it starts to broaden out and you start to see individual impacts at the landscape regional scale, that's when, of course, you start to see population and community composition effects. And so you just need to keep that in mind when you're thinking about the scale. Okay, so let's talk about a few examples. Again, these are just examples I pulled from the literature. It's limited to the sagebrush ecosystem, and this is just a picture of the sage-grouse current range and some of the priority areas of conservation in green, just to get your head wrapped around the scale and extent that we're talking about when I talk about the sagebrush ecosystem. And so the sage-grouse, I'm just using them kind of as an ecosystem focal species. They also are kind of considered an umbrella species, just like Roy mentioned for the desert tortoise. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. However, there are over 350 vertebrate species that depend upon the sagebrush during part or all of their life history. Some of these species, these are just a few mentioned. Some of these are obligates where they're very closely tied to the sagebrush, and then others are associated with sagebrush. Yet little research to understand direct or indirect impact of invasives on wildlife in the sagebrush ecosystem. Many species such as invertebrates or other small mammals, amphibians, reptiles get even less attention. And as we've already talked about how the effect or the impact on the trophic level plays a large role in the level of that impact, but we really have limited information on especially like those lower trophic level species from insect communities to some of the amphibians and reptiles and small mammals. But I've got a few examples. As you look at the studies, when I kind of did the cursory review, of course, as you can guess, most studies are dealing with the cheatgrass impacts. This is just a map, again, to show the breadth, the scope, the extent of the cheatgrass invasion, and again, within that sagebrush ecosystem. And most studies are talking about the cheatgrass. And I'll mention if I have something specific relative to Medusahead or Ventenata. And we know the connection to, you know, Matt Brooks' great talk relative to fire frequency and intensity, and things are increasing. And we understand the immediate and catastrophic impacts you can get with a wildfire on wildlife. One of the sad examples, you know, relative to this, I think people sometimes forget, but are things like, and this is just one small example out of several that we've had in the last few years. This was the Sutherland Canyon fire in Washington, where 30,000 acres were burned of privately owned and federally managed sagebrush. But this was high quality habitat within a particular recovery area for the endangered Columbia Basin pygmy rabbit. So we're already talking about very specific areas on the landscape that are important to this particular species of wildlife. You get a fire come in there, you have that direct effect of the fire. And 38 rabbits survived in their burrows, were captured and relocated to one of 2 remaining recovery areas, while 74 of the rabbits did die in the fire. The good news is there is now a multi-partner, again, restoration plan to try to limit cheatgrass invasion. They did some plantings and seedings. And when we think about this again from a management standpoint, this is where understanding that impact can really play a major role, because now we know we need to think about these particular areas for our management, how they are impacted. We know for some other research, cheatgrass decreases food availability and burrowing opportunities for this species. And thinking about that relative to your management actions, this can help inform those decisions. This next example with the direct effect of fire is the fact that we know that we oftentimes lose sagebrush cover with these fires. And the impact is not on just sage-grouse. These folks with the Sage-Grouse Initiative, Science to Solutions Group, and with the Intermountain Joint Venture, they did some they looked at the amount of sagebrush cover loss and the impact not on some songbirds, the brewer's sagebrush sparrow and the sage thrasher. All of these are pretty much sagebrush obligates. That ties them very tightly to the ecosystem for success and persistence. And with the increase in fires, they've suffered population decline. So we're already worried about these other passerine birds. The joint venture looked at abundance data with the sagebrush cover for these species, and they found that abundance for these species doubled when that particular area had greater than or equal to 40% of sagebrush on the landscape. Well, when we think about it from the sagegrass standpoint, we also know that 90% of active leks also exceed that 40% of sagebrush cover. Well, when we think about this from our management actions, they took the conservation actions that were already identified as priority management actions for weed management and fire suppression and overlapped it with the abundance and found that these management actions were already, though they were designed with sage-grouse in mind, they already were going to benefit these other species as well. 50% of the sagebrush sparrow and sage thrasher abundance was tied to these priority areas for management. 85% for the brewers, and they had some of the juniper removal with this one also. But this is great news. Their actions can be shown to be significantly important to grouse and a large portion of these songbirds and relative to their abundance. So these conservation actions for grouse are benefiting these songbirds as well. And what that does is basically give you information on the cost benefit of your management actions. You're getting a higher return on your investment, and having this type of information and this understanding the tie to the impact can then help you prioritize management actions, show a higher return. Oftentimes then that leads to additional discussions, partners, or being able to leverage additional funds. Now, we've talked about the cheatgrass standpoint from the fire standpoint, and we have, of course, this is a triple threat webinar. We've got Medusahead that's moving in that we all know about. And then, of course, we have Ventenata as well. Matt Brooks did mention the fact that these are also potentially changing the fire regime. But there's just not many studies associated with other types of impacts with Medusahead and Ventenata. I do have a couple of examples, and I'll put these kind of toward the end. So let's talk about just a few of the examples that are in the literature. And again, most of these are with sage grouse. So how does sage grouse respond? We do know that hens select nest sites with less cheatgrass. When we look at the local scale, when we look at the landscape scale, lek trends tend to be lower as the cover of exotic vegetation increases. And that's not been separated out for cheatgrass, Medusahead, and Ventenata, but we can start to assume, right? That's where we've got to go again with some of this type of information. We know we have that information, but there's still so much we don't know. We think it's tied to the forage, what they're eating out there. Ants, beetles, and grasshoppers are primary sources of protein for greater sage-grouse chicks, and adults will too, to some degree, at certain times of the year. And some University of Idaho has been thinking about and looking into this idea of the ants these particular ants establish large visible colonies, and they're a huge component of the diet adjacent to the lek sites. And these colonies, these ant colonies, tend to be found in native perennial plant communities. And as you start to get the annual grass moving in, you get a lower concentration of the colonies. Ants eat the seeds of those native perennial plants and the insect prey for the ants within those perennial communities. And as you start to change that plant community, you start to look at things like the annual grasses may deposit those seeds as a single pulse and may not have a consistent food resource as far as other insects with those invasive annual grasses. And so again, you can start to see those trophic level impacts and how it could affect potentially sage grouse or survival of the chicks. So it's important to think about these impacts in terms of at what life stage also that it's occurring, to be able to help understand that impact also from that local standpoint to that broader landscape scale, and then population impacts. Reptiles, not much. This one particular paper did find a degree and type of cover was important predictor of presence on roads. They looked at several species, but they only had enough sample sizes for gopher snakes and western rattlesnakes. Roadsides dominated by the invasive grasses had higher vegetative cover, which we all kind of know, and this was linked to higher road mortality. More snake crossings and road mortality could lead to populations becoming fragmented over time, and then what kind of effect does that have on the population? When we think about mechanisms to that correlation in that more snake crossings and increased road mortality, we think about movement tendencies, especially the difference among those different species. Lower abundance of mammal species potentially in those areas, decreased burrow densities in the cheatgrass habitat. And as you start to see a reduction of prey availability and refugia, that could lead then to the snakes having increased surface activity. Maybe they're foraging across a broader area, and so then there's an increased exposure to roads and traffic. So at first glance you think, okay, but how could that again affect management? Well, this paper was good because it really did bring in that management piece where even at this level, you can start to think about altering land practices to minimize road fatalities. If this was an endangered species or this was a particular important species for that area, then working with your partners to not plant invasive grasses, which they were doing in one of the areas that this paper was associated with, and or just managing those non-native grasses along the roadsides or in association with construction projects or road development. Another example was with the desert horned lizard. This was a little bit longer ago. There was a significant negative association between cheatgrass and lizard scat abundance. So they thought they might be avoiding those areas. They looked and found that it did affect mobility and sprint performance. So where they had reduced mobility, they were hypothesizing that this may affect predation rates on themselves and while they were foraging, and leading to foraging efficiency, which could then, of course, lead to population declines. They also know that cheatgrass areas may support different ant assemblages, and so again, that indirect effect may be a change in prey availability. Small mammals, shifts in vegetation characteristics resulting from invasions can alter availability of food resources, predation risk, and foraging efficiency, thereby changing animal communities and populations. Abundance and diversity tend to decrease with increasing cheatgrass cover, but it really varies across the species. The small mammal group is quite large. There's a lot of different species, and so you really have to start looking more specifically. The granivorous and insectivorous species tend to decrease, which fits in line with some of these arthropods decreasing with cheatgrass cover. While omnivorous and herbivorous species become more common. That kind of pattern was found a few times. They also talked about the importance of not looking at species richness in these areas because of that kind of washing out that effect. Some mechanisms might be displacing the food source of those native plant seeds and the arthropods that we've talked about, and then of course changing that vegetation structure and increasing the predation risk on the small mammals. Also, there's been found deeper litter created by the cheatgrass, and we know that Medusahead definitely also has deeper litter oftentimes, may actually impede movement of the small mammals and increase the cost in terms of time and energy of those small mammals to find food. And by decreasing the foraging efficiency, of course, and access to food resources, then you could potentially get population declines. This was also brought up with sage-grouse chicks. Those little round bundles of sage-grouse chicks are not streamlined, if you will, to also get through this deeper litter or the thicker areas of the cheatgrass, and could be affecting or impacting their foraging behavior as well, has been brought up. So we need to understand something like small mammals impacts from annual grasses, because we know that small mammals are very important from regulating plant communities, improving soil quality. They're a host to several zoonotic diseases, and they're essential prey. They're at that bottom of the trophic level for many predators of birds and other mammals and reptiles. And so we need to understand this. And I just throw up, this is a breeding habitat of the golden eagle map, just to show again that it fits kind of across that scope of the sagebrush ecosystem. And when we start thinking about small mammal populations having significant impacts, you can quickly start to see the level of how that could grow across the landscape and how we would have to deal with this, and how do we deal with those trade-offs of those decisions. And so to finish up with the different groups of animals, the arthropods, the insects, another prey base, very important. This is also such a large and diverse group. There's not a clear picture. Andrea Litt did a nice review in 2014, actually, but only one of the papers that was part of that extensive review was cheatgrass. But in general, if you think about invasive species, abundance often decreases, yet others you see an increase. Again, the predaceous arthropods, ones that are eating other insects, generally decreased, reflecting that indirect effect of reduction in prey, while something like detritivores increased, likely in response to that increased litter, but sizable information gaps. But similar to the small mammals, we must understand the responses of these insects to invasive plants to help us be informed relative to biodiversity, ecological processes, with so many organisms depending on arthropods as prey or for their functional role in the system with pollination, seed dispersal, and decomposition. So Medusahead and Ventenata, not very many papers talking about specific wildlife impacts from these invasions. We know that it does alter vegetation characteristics. Also, therefore, we're assuming again also that it diminishes wildlife habitat. We know forage production, there have been studies relative to that and ecosystem functions. Most of the negative impacts in the literature is generally limited to livestock forage production after the invasion, so little information on the impacts to plant diversity and wildlife habitat. There is some suggestion of a little bit of a difference from cheatgrass. I just wanted to point out that maybe the Medusahead invasions, I need to explore this a little bit more, might not have as significant of an impact on the sagebrush and the forbs. And with the sagebrush and forbs being critical food sources for many of our wildlife species, that deserves a little further investigation. Ventenata, the new one on the scene, from the standpoint of people paying attention to it, I think it's been around, most of us think it's been around longer than we thought, but when we started looking for it, we're definitely noticing it in a lot of places. Tim Prather and some grad students out of the University of Idaho actually have a pretty cool study looking at tree swallows. And they did find, or they're starting to find, the egg to fledging success is dropping from almost 80% to 44% is tied to that reduced insect abundance in those areas dominated by Ventenata, which in turn, of course, decreased foraging success of nesting pairs. So then they would basically fledge fewer young as well. So these are the type of studies where it would really be nice to have some more that are very specifically tied to specific species. So to start winding up, I just want to leave you with something to think about and how we perceive impacts and how we tie that to management. When we think about impact, this is a value judgment. The impact of a non-native species is a value judgment based on our criteria, if we think that's bad or good, or the level of the impact of bad or good. And we make those decisions personally, as a professional, personally, relative to economics, aesthetics, ecological function and ecosystem processes of things like we've been talking about, human health, diseases, and these values can change. I think it's interesting to me as we work with partners and you're sitting around a table with several individuals working for several agencies or their neighboring landowners, we need to think about how everyone is in their mind and in their heart thinking about this level of impact. What's the value judgment of that invasion that you're trying to decide on, put money to? What's the value judgment of that invasion and how it impacts wildlife on federal lands versus public lands? Maybe that value judgment is different for that wildlife impact on federal lands versus the private landowner. I don't know. Particularly recreational areas or energy development areas, like Roy's example is a great example of this idea. And does our perception affect where we place that management or our definition of success? As a federal or private landowner compared to a neighboring landowner, what's my definition of success relative to that impact or that impact that we're trying to reduce? So what can we do with those kind of things in mind and why we need to understand the level of impacts from what? Impacts to wildlife. If we understand the values of these impacts, it helps us improve the estimates of the benefits of those management actions, right? It helps us identify that return on our investment, like the example with the songbirds. We need to understand the mechanism of how that invasive plant affects the animals we're interested in, because it can help provide insights for how we design that management or how we design different treatments or steps of treatments in alternative ways to help reduce that impact or help inform the restoration. And we need to be, like the snake example, we need to become better informed of species impacts with their relationship to sagebrush and that life stage that they're affected and how that may affect conservation status among other species. There's a lot of wildlife species out there, so that we can effectively understand those management trade-offs. And finally, how do these impacts translate across the landscape? At what point will we see more of a population effect? And can we use that information to help show how well we're doing with our conservation efforts? So to finish up, besides a call for more information on wildlife impacts, first and foremost, we know the main principle is to promote rangeland health. We can do that by preventing new invasions and, of course, reduce existing invasions. We have to put more attention to maintaining our native communities and identifying those areas that are most at risk, and gain prevention commitment, practice early detection and rapid response. I know when we talk about these annual grasses, we kind of giggle at the fact of, or think about early detection and rapid response, but there are areas that are not invaded, and we need to identify those and then start looking at those relative to where we can maintain these communities and prevent these wildlife impacts. In these areas that are already invaded, then we need to continue to prioritize those and see where we can get the biggest bang for our buck, or the highest return on our investment will help us make those decisions if we understand the impacts when we try to reduce these invasions. And we must not forget, as sobering as the invasive annual grasses are, we must integrate the other invasive species out there, like leafy spurge, yellow star thistle, Russian knapweed, that will have their own impacts and weed succession issues that we will need to address. And Matt Germino mentioned this, we're starting to see some of these other invasive species move in, even in response to our annual grass management. But to leave on a positive note, with all our partners, be they landowners in the common fight, or the researchers providing more impact information, we can be successful at the biome level for prevention and early detection and rapid response, and we can be very successful at the local and regional level to reduce existing invasions in high priority areas, and hopefully those areas will reduce wildlife impacts.
Thanks, Lindy. All right, everybody who is tuning in remotely, I'm going to have y'all unmute yourselves, turn your cameras back on. And we have our first question from Hillary, Hillary Whitcomb in Salt Lake, I think, a fellow USU graduate. And I'm going to read her question, and that's going to allow everybody else to sort of type in their questions. And if everybody, let's see, Matt, you are still, we can't see you, but I guess that's okay. And Matt Brooks, we can't see you, but we can hear you. So Hillary asks, and I think this is probably for Lindy, but I'm going to let anybody else chime in if they want to. In regard to increased mortalities near roads with non-native grasses, what are your thoughts about the concept that well-restored habitat adjacent to roads may provide sink areas by drawing species to the road compared to poorer quality habitat in the surrounding area?
Absolutely. I mean, we could see something like that. I mean, we hear a lot about that in terms of ecological traps, depending on the types of habitats out there, or even with invaded areas. So that's a valid point that people would have to, again, that's where you can't focus down on a particular local site. You would need to look at that broader and that what that context would be, so that you would try to avoid something like that. Great question.
So Hillary, my master's research was on wildlife crossing structures, particularly pertaining to mule deer. That was something that often people were concerned with. So, okay, so you're going to draw these wildlife to this road crossing and create this nice cover so that they're safe, they feel safe to cross under the highway. I guess for mule deer, and we didn't talk a lot about mule deer, but they don't like to be around roads. So they're going to be in the area as quick and out of the area as quick as possible. So that's one thing, just a perspective about mule deer or other ungulates. They want to get in and out as quickly as possible, but creating a covered area is the best answer for ungulate species. Anybody else have questions? I mean, there might be some in the audience, Gloria, that we just can't see, so feel free.
So folks, what do you think? This is a lot of information, a lot of high quality stuff. Everybody's still awake. So it's pretty great. We have a microphone here, and I can repeat the question up here for the panelists that we have. What questions do you have about some of this information? Yeah, here we are. This is Dr. Harry Quick.
Okay, this is a question for Roy. You showed some pictures of Joshua tree.
Yes.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you showed pictures of Joshua trees impacted by fire. So my question is, how resilient are they to wildfire, the Joshua tree? Do they come back after the hot fires, or do they just die, and are they eliminated after a wildfire?
I think I'm going to guess that Matt Brooks probably knows a little bit better than me, but my guess is that they're pretty well nuked and don't re-sprout very readily or anything like that. Matt, do you have a better sense?
Yeah, just in a nutshell, they will re-sprout, and a lot of studies in the past indicated that they were resilient because of
Okay.
following post-fire, just like 3 years, 4 years. But some work that Todd and Leslie did in Joshua Tree National Park, I think, showed that especially if there's drought years following, they'll re-sprout, but that rodents, lagomorphs, will browse them, eat them, and actually lead to their mortality. So even though they can re-sprout, oftentimes there's interaction with wildlife that leads to their lowered resiliency and mortality following fire.
All right. Any other questions here before I start thinking of a whole bunch and delay our break?
I have one for Lindy. You talked about federal agencies, state agencies having these different drivers for their management decisions. In your opinion, what is the main driver for the West? Is it more fire related? Is it habitat restoration? Is our decisions being made based on the safety of different species? What in your opinion?
I guess in my opinion, it would be that we're making our management decisions of where to place management actions on the ground. Definitely we have to prioritize relative to fire and fire risk and fire suppression. There's no doubt. We know that. We want to save people. We want to save livelihoods and communities. But I think a lot of us in the invasive species management realm just would like to have more folks from that perspective, from just the invasive species perspective, and with the wildlife impacts, the state needs and some of their state noxious weed laws and what drives them, more of a seat at the table for that discussion. The fuel breaks is a great example one. Matt Brooks talked about that. We know that fuel breaks potentially are going to inoculate the landscape with potential invasions, possibly, much less the maintenance of fuel breaks that we have to think about that. We have to design fuel breaks for safety first and foremost, but can we further that conversation? Because I know it occurs. Can we further that from an invasive species management standpoint? So there's a lot of pieces of that. Fire is a big driver. Fire has its own structure within the federal system and even the state system that has a significant amount of funding, capacity, and structure, where the invasive species management realm, which is the same model. When you think about the fire model, it's prevent, detect, control, and suppress, or suppress and control. It's the same model for invasive species management. We don't have near the structure or the capacity for that. And so I think I'm answering your question. If not, let me know, but that's kind of my perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks.
Lori, we have about 1 minute left, but somebody posted a question and I'll read it. Do we have evidence of which native grasses or forbs are competitive against these 3 annual invasives? Are those studies in Colorado? So any of our speakers are welcome to chime in and try and summarize your thoughts in a couple minutes, and then we will try and start on time at 10:30.
Most of the information is for cheatgrass. There's a number of studies from California and also in the Great Basin. There's some studies also from Colorado. I'll give you an example of 2 wide-ranging native grasses that are thought to be some of the better contenders for competition. Those are blue bunch wheatgrass and sandbirch bluegrass. Both of those tend to be early season perennial bunch grasses. They can resprout. They're both widespread. They occur across many habitat types in sagebrush steppe and also in other ecosystem types. But probably what are more common and more emphasized are non-native species, crested wheatgrass, for example. And so is that species non-native, or should we consider it to be now naturalized? Crested wheatgrass is just one example of a species that we can get a lot of seed from and fairly reliably establish it where and when we need to. There's a lot of collateral impacts with those introduced and now, depending on your perspective, naturalized species.
Great, Matt. Gloria, what do you think? Should we stick to our schedule and try and take a break and then get back at 10:30?
Yeah, I'd vote for that. There's another question here. Let me make sure I'm unmuted. Matt nailed a real challenge to restoration. Long-term project funding, as we know. Any experience or ideas about how to restructure our restoration funding to provide long-term efforts, the long-term efforts needed to really affect a long-term change? Basically funding that's meaningful enough in the long term. So what I suggest is we go ahead and take a break, and the panelists that are here, Matt and Lindy, and the two Matts, and Lindy and Roy, are welcome you to post responses in chat. I think that would be a great idea, so we have multiple responses. And we can review that maybe at the end of the question period.
Sounds like a great idea. We'll see everybody back in about 13 minutes.
Okay, and for all the online participants, Megan will be putting a slide up with the online form. I don't know what that's from. That might be it. The online form with a link to the continuing education credits. I think it's...
Yeah, I'm not sure what that noise is either, so...
Wow, everything's going really well already. Our microphone is off.
Oh, okay, I think it just stopped, so maybe it was just one of our feedback things. So,
okay,
you can see my screen though.
10:30. Thanks. I think it's good.
Great.
All right. No questions, you guys? So exciting.
Too many questions.
Too many questions?